My own son walked past me on the street and pretended I didn't exist. That's how it happened. Cold, raw, brutal. A moment that lasted only seconds, but to me, it felt like an eternity. Before I go on, let me ask you something. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and hit subscribe. Because every comment, every subscription, is living proof that inside a family, respect isn't a favor, it's a duty. Together, we show the world that dignity isn't begged for, it's earned. The sidewalk was crowded. December's cold wind cut across my face, carrying the metallic smell of melting snow mixed with car exhaust. I had just stepped out of the corner barbershop, still wearing the sharp scent of pine aftershave on my skin. I walked slowly, glancing at the glowing holiday displays in store windows, when my eyes met his. Lucas, my son. He was coming from the other side of the street, sharp in a dark suit, red tie perfectly straightened, a leather briefcase in hand like a trophy of power. He walked with confidence, each step firm, like a man already used to being admired. Inside me, my heart leapt. That old mixture of pride and longing hit me, memories of when he was just a boy, running into my arms at the school gate. I almost raised my hand. I almost called out his name, but I didn't need to, because he saw me first. Yes, he saw me. He recognized my face, my stance. Our eyes locked for a split second, and in that very second, he turned away, pretended to check his phone, pretended to be busy, pretended I was a stranger. He quickened his pace, walked right past me as if I were invisible. My own son. The shame burned hotter than the winter wind. My hands shook, my throat closed tight. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, that maybe he hadn't really noticed me. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't an accident. It was a choice. He chose to deny me. Behind me, I heard a woman's heels slow down, and I caught her sideways glance. Her face said it all. Pity. A stranger witnessing the humiliation of a father rejected. A kid riding by on a bike chuckled softly, not really knowing why, but picking up on the awkward tension in the air. The whole world seemed to be watching, even in silence. And me? I stood frozen in the middle of the street. The wind hit hard, but what hurt wasn't the winter. It was the crushing feeling of being discarded, like an old, useless object. Inside, one question tore through me. What did I do to deserve this? I had worked my whole life with these hands, built a house brick by brick, paid for his college with debt and calluses, gave him everything I had. And still, he didn't just ignore me, he erased me. But sometimes pain changes color. The shame that first broke me started boiling inside. It shifted into a dry, cold anger. Not wild anger, but sharp, calculated strength. And with it came a decision. If he had the courage to deny me in front of strangers, then I would have the courage to deny his name, where it really mattered. Not with shouting, not in that instant, but in silence heavier than 1,000 words, in the inheritance office. I kept walking slowly. The crowd flowed on, indifferent, but inside me, one world had collapsed, and another was already being built. And it was there, on that frozen December street, that I learned the hardest lesson of my life. When someone tries to erase you, it's up to you to decide if you'll stay invisible, or if you'll light a fire no one can ignore. After that day on the street, when my own son acted like he didn't know me, I went home carrying a stone in my chest. My house has always been my refuge, built with my own 2 hands, every board chosen carefully, every corner marked by sweat and patience. It was a simple house, but solid, with the smell of wood, tools, and fresh coffee always in the air. The walls held stories no one seemed to want to hear anymore. The worn couch, covered with a knitted blanket made by my late wife, still bore the imprint of the spot where she used to sit and sew. The kitchen, with its faded tiles, was the stage for countless family meals, laughter, arguments, plans for the future. And now, every detail reminded me of the distance between me and the son I had raised. I am Harold Benton, retired carpenter, 69 years old, living in that space like a keeper of memories. My days were slow. I woke up early, as I always had, brewed strong coffee, read the yellowed newspaper, then walked out to the small workshop in the back. I still built furniture for neighbors or repaired old pieces, not because I needed the money, my pension was enough, but because my hands didn't know how to live without wood. Out there, among sawdust and hammer strikes, I felt like myself again. But when it came to family, nothing felt intact. My son, Lucas Benton, had taken another path, studied law in New York, returned to our town as a rising attorney, known for his tailored suits, sharp speeches, and wealthy clients. He liked being seen in expensive restaurants, drove an imported car that turned heads in the courthouse parking lot. He had become exactly what he always wanted, someone respected. And ironically to him, I was the shame to be hidden. His wife, Sophie, completed the picture. Elegant woman, perfect posture, smile measured to the millimeter. She never treated me badly outright, but she never hid her discomfort either. At family gatherings, my silence seemed to disturb her. I saw the quick glances, the way she shifted topics when I tried to join in. And then there was Eleanor, my youngest, 31, an art teacher at a public school. Unlike her brother, she never turned her back on me. She came often, brought homemade bread, sat with me on the porch listening to my stories. But even she no longer had the strength to bridge the growing gap between me and Lucas. Dad, he's always been proud, but deep down, I know he loves you, she'd say. I just smiled, because I didn't believe those comforting words anymore. The world around us seemed to echo that distance. Rochester, our town, was gray and cold in the winter, streets buried in snow, mornings heavy with silence. I walked those sidewalks like a man invisible. The stores, the bakeries, the neighbors, they all knew me. Old Benton, the honest carpenter, always ready to help. But in my son's mouth, my name was reduced to subtle jokes, like my life was nothing but a forgotten footnote. I remember one Thanksgiving, not long before that day in the street. Lucas's house was full. Colleagues, neighbors, polished guests. I sat at the table, watching the abundance served on porcelain plates. Then Lucas raised his glass of wine for a toast. His tone was light, almost joking. My dad's a simple man, lived his life with a hammer and saw, always good with wood, but he never understood business. Laughter followed, some polite, some nervous. I lowered my eyes to my plate. Eleanor squeezed my hand under the table, trying to give me strength. But inside, something cracked. It was as if, at every meeting, he found pleasure in cutting me down, as if he wanted to erase everything I had ever built. And there, between crystal glasses and polite laughter, I realized it wasn't just Rochester's icy wind that made me tremble. It was the weight of a silent injustice. Behind Lucas's smile, there was contempt. Behind Sophie's glances, there was judgment. And behind my patience, a quiet anger was beginning to grow, one I didn't show to anyone. After all, I wasn't just a humiliated father. I was a man who, in silence, still carried power in his hands, and they had no idea that the very silence that made me seem fragile would become the strength behind my turn of fate. When I close my eyes and look back, I see my hands always busy. Hammers, saws, nails, sandpaper. Those were the tools that shaped not only furniture, but the entire life of my family. Every board I cut, every nail I hammered was also a silent promise that my children would have more than I ever did. I worked 45 years as a carpenter. No job was too small, no client unimportant. I fixed doors that wouldn't close, built tables that became heirlooms, raised bookshelves that still hold stories for families who barely remember my name. I was always the man called to fix what no one else wanted to deal with, and I did it with pride, with dignity. In the early mornings, the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the sawdust stuck to the shop floor. My life had that unique perfume, freshly cut wood, sweat, and persistence. While other men chased after status, I chased after sustenance. Every sleepless night, every ache in my shoulders became food on the table. School books for my kids, bills paid. That's how I managed to pay for Lucas's law degree, the son who now denies me. It wasn't easy. Years of debt, impossible deadlines, days without rest. I remember mornings when I was up before sunrise to carry heavy planks, and nights sanding furniture under the weak light of the shop. Every check I wrote to the university felt like a piece of me being torn away, but I smiled because I believed I was building something greater than myself. While I poured out my strength, Lucas studied in tall buildings, silent libraries, surrounded by people who never knew what a callus felt like. I was proud. I clipped out newspaper mentions of his name when he made a merit list, showed them to neighbors, to friends at the shop. That's my boy, I'd say, chest full, even if later I had to hide the overdue electric bill. What he never knew, or maybe pretended to forget, was that behind every one of his victories stood one of my sacrifices. When he traveled to Washington in his final year of college, I sold my old pickup truck to pay for the trip. When he needed a new laptop, I went 3 months without buying clothes. When he wanted to take an unpaid internship in New York, I doubled my workload to cover his rent. And still, none of it seemed to matter. To his eyes, I was just a simple man, stuck in the past. He grew, drifted away, and every success of his turned quietly into an accusation against me, as if I had stood still, as if the world had kept turning and I'd been left behind, but I never stopped. The house he grew up in was built by me, with these hands, brick by brick, board by board. His room, with the blue walls I painted in one long night, still carries the faint smell of that stubborn paint. The swing in the backyard, built from thick ropes and sturdy wood, still creaks in the wind. They were symbols of love, of care. Today, they're only memories. Lucas, though, learned to be ashamed of all of it. When people asked about the house, he'd say he lived in an old, too simple place. He never told anyone his father had built it, never admitted that his comfortable life began on wood I cut with sweat and blood. That's the deepest pain of sacrifice, realizing someone else has turned your effort into nothing. But maybe you, listening to me now, know exactly what I mean. Maybe you've also given everything for someone who chose to act like they never needed you. Maybe you've felt invisible in the very moment you most deserved to be seen. And that's why this story isn't just mine, it's yours too. I don't tell this to beg for pity. I tell it because I want you to help me prove something, that the value of a life is not in titles or imported cars, but in the respect no one has the right to steal. So tell me, have you ever sacrificed for someone who pretended to forget it all? Share it here in the comments. Your voice matters. And subscribe to the channel. Because every time you comment, every time you take part, we show the world together that dignity isn't charity. Dignity is earned. Thanksgiving dinner at Lucas's house was the turning point I didn't see right away. To this day, I remember the details as if they were photographs burned into my memory. His house was glowing, full of guests. The smell of roasted turkey mixed with spices filled the air, and crystal glasses chimed with every toast. Laughter, raised voices, quick footsteps serving dishes I couldn't even pronounce. I felt out of place, a visitor in a world I once helped build, but no longer belonged to. Lucas, as always, was the center of attention. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his gold tie catching the chandelier's light. He smiled with that confidence he had mastered in public. Beside him, Sophie, flawless, moved through the room with ease, greeting guests and chatting gracefully. The two of them looked like actors in a play, and I was only an extra without lines. I sat at one end of the long dining table. The polished wood gleamed, but to me it felt cold, distant. Eleanor sat by my side, trying to draw me into conversation, but most of our words were swallowed by the hum of everyone else. Then came the moment that changed everything. Lucas raised his wine glass. He called for silence with a hand gesture, smiling at his guests. His voice filled the room. Tonight we celebrate another year of victories. He looked around, savoring the eyes fixed on him. I want to thank my wife, Sophie, for being by my side every step of the way, and my colleagues, who are here tonight, for their constant support. He paused briefly, and then came the sentence that cut me open. And of course I can't forget my father. Everyone turned to me, some smiling, expecting a heartfelt tribute. He's always been a simple man, an honest worker, spent his life with a hammer and saw, but he never had the vision to grow. The laughter that spread around the table wasn't loud, but it pierced me deeper than any scream. Some guests tried to mask their discomfort, others genuinely found it amusing. I lowered my eyes, feeling the blood pound in my face. Eleanor beside me squeezed my hand under the table. Her eyes said it all. Hold on. But how could I hold on when my own son reduced my entire life to a punchline? As he went on with his speech, talking about contracts, big clients, and new projects, I stopped hearing the words. His voice reached me muffled, like I was underwater. What echoed in my mind was the phrase, "Never had the vision to grow." Is that what I was to him? An example of failure? In that instant, I remembered the sleepless nights, the planks I carried alone, the bills I paid with sweat, all so he could stand there, in that hall, surrounded by people applauding him. And in front of them, he shrank me down until I was nothing. I looked around. I saw a gray-haired man, a colleague of his, fiddling with his cufflinks, uneasy. An older woman, probably a neighbor, lowered her eyes to her plate, unwilling to meet mine. A few younger guests raised their glasses, laughing quietly, as if it were perfectly normal for a son to mock his father. That complicit silence in the room was more cruel than the words themselves. I wanted to stand, slam my hand on the table, and shout that without me he never would have made it there. But I didn't, not because I lacked courage, but because I knew shouting would only become another humiliation. I would be seen as the bitter old man, out of place. So I stayed quiet, and in that silence, a weight settled inside me. It wasn't just anger, it was the beginning of a decision. When the night ended, the guests left with warm handshakes and cheerful goodbyes. I rose slowly, my bones aching not only from age, but from contempt. Sophie gave me a mechanical hug, nothing but formality. Lucas shook my hand quickly, already turning to someone he found more important. At that moment I understood. There was no place for me in that world. But I also realized something greater. I still had the power to decide the future. I stepped out of the house, the cold wind cutting across my face. The sound of the door closing behind me was like a final period. I walked down the sidewalk under Christmas lights, and inside me a certainty was being born. The humiliation of that night would not be forgotten. It would be transformed. After that Thanksgiving dinner, I began to see my son differently. Not that I hadn't known, deep down, that he belittled me, but that sentence, spoken in public, in front of so many people, opened a wound that refused to heal. And like any wound left open, it burned more with every little gesture, every daily slight I had once tried to ignore. It was those details, seemingly small, that revealed the naked truth. I wasn't just forgotten, I was discarded. I remember one Sunday when I tried calling him. The phone rang and rang until voicemail picked up. I waited for a return call that never came. 2 days later, I saw on social media a photo of him smiling at a fancy restaurant with colleagues. The caption read, "Real family is the one you choose." It stabbed me like a knife. Because I wasn't part of that chosen family, I was the shadow he avoided. Another time, at a Christmas gathering at an uncle's house, Lucas arrived late with Sophie. They handed out expensive gifts wrapped in shining paper. When I stepped forward to greet him, he said loudly for everyone to hear, "Dad, careful with that old coat. You might stain Sophie's dress." The laughter came like a cruel chorus. I stood frozen, forcing a thin smile to hide the pain. My daughter Eleanor looked at me with tears in her eyes. She knew every word was meant to shrink me. There was also the day at the courthouse. I had gone to watch one of his hearings, proud just to see my son in action. I sat quietly in the back. When our eyes met, he frowned, then leaned toward his colleagues and said, "That's my dad. He insists on showing up here, but he doesn't understand a thing that's going on." They laughed. I lowered my eyes to the blue carpeted floor, pretending I hadn't heard. But inside me, something snapped. And it wasn't just the words. It was the silences too. The invitations that never came. The birthday parties where my name wasn't on the list. The family gatherings I only discovered through social media, too late to attend. I was treated as if I no longer existed, though I was breathing right there. Each small gesture was a brutal reminder that, to him, I wasn't a father. I was a burden. Even when Eleanor hosted a small gathering at her place, Lucas showed up only out of obligation. He arrived late, stayed briefly, and before leaving, said in a low voice, but loud enough for me to hear, "You should sell this old house, Eleanor. It's ridiculous for Dad to keep living surrounded by outdated junk." Ridiculous. That was the word. At that moment, I looked around the room. I saw the shelves I had built with my own hands, the table I made from leftover wood, the chairs I had sanded and varnished countless times. To me, they were symbols of effort. To him, they were nothing but ridiculous. But perhaps the worst moment was the day I actually needed him. I had a sharp pain in my chest one night, a difficult night. The next morning, I called just to tell him. I didn't ask for help, didn't demand anything. I just wanted to hear my son's voice. He picked up, but his answer was short. "Dad, I'm in a meeting. If it's not urgent, tell me later." And he hung up. I sat in the armchair, staring at the silent phone. I thought of all the times I had run to him when he was a child, all the nights I stayed up tending fevers, all the bills I paid at the cost of my own body. And now, his voice sounded like that of a rushed stranger. These episodes piled up into a bitter collection inside me. They weren't grand tragedies on their own, but together, they became a high wall, built from indifference, contempt, and coldness. Every word, every silence, every absence was another brick he stacked between us. And over time, that wall stopped being just a barrier between father and son. It became fuel. Because while Lucas believed he was slowly erasing me, he didn't realize he was giving me strength. Strength to endure, to plan, to turn every insult into part of something greater. I didn't yet know how, I didn't yet know when, but I knew the answer would come. And when it did, it wouldn't be in shouts or in useless arguments. It would come in silence, sharper than any word. It would strike where he least expected, and it would be final. The decision didn't mature overnight. It was born in silence, fed on pain, and grew in the shadows of humiliation. While Lucas paraded around in his tailored suits and sharp speeches, I was learning to keep quiet, and in that silence, each beat of my heart became a countdown. I was never a man of revenge. I always preferred work over confrontation, but I had reached the point where silence was no longer patience, it was cowardice, and I could no longer accept that my own son was erasing me from the story of my own life. That's when I began to plan, not with words, with actions. That week, I walked to the courthouse downtown. The old building sat on the main square, its red brick walls and tall windows always carrying the smell of aged paper and ink stamps. I remember pushing open the heavy wooden door, the creak echoing through the quiet corridor. The clerk glanced at me with disinterest, but when I mentioned the word will, his posture changed. I sat at a cold metal desk and asked to review my document. From my pocket, I pulled out a worn brown leather folder, the same one I'd carried for decades, frayed at the edges but still intact. That folder held more than papers. It held my life. The clerk slid the pages in front of me, and there it was, the name Lucas Benton, written in firm letters, granting him the right to everything I had built, my house, my savings, my modest investments, every piece of land, every piece of furniture I had carefully preserved. For a few seconds, I stared at that name. I remembered the baby I once cradled in my arms, the first words I heard.
From him, the smile that once promised it would all be worth it. Now that same name felt like an open wound. I lifted my eyes and said, my voice steady, I want this name removed. The clerk looked at me in silence, as if trying to confirm I understood the weight of what I had just said. Are you certain, sir? He asked, adjusting his glasses. I answered with a slow nod. No doubt, no turning back. Signing those papers was like nailing shut a door that would never open again. My pen slid across
the page, and every letter of my signature struck against years of ingratitude. I stepped out of the courthouse with the cold wind biting my face, but inside me burned a fire, not of rage, but of release. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had taken back control of the story. But I told no one, not even Eleanor, not the neighbors. The leather folder went back into the corner of my closet, hidden beneath stacks of old documents. It was my secret, my trump card, while Lucas kept, treating me as if I didn't exist. I watched him in silence. Every mocking comment, every dismissal, now had a different taste. It no longer wounded me, because I knew something he didn't. He thought he was winning. I was just waiting for the right moment to turn the game. I began visiting places I had never been. I found a trusted lawyer, recommended by an old friend, to review every detail. I wanted to make sure nothing could be contested. I wanted to seal my decision. In our meetings, we spoke in hushed tones, like conspirators. He explained clauses, showed me options, and I listened carefully. Every word was another piece of the plan falling into place. Meanwhile, at home, my routine never changed. The workshop still smelled of sawdust. Coffee still brewed every morning. Neighbors still came by asking for repairs. On the outside, I was the same old man. But inside, every strike of the hammer on the workbench reminded me, soon, it would be my turn to prove I wasn't finished. I had become an actor in my own play. When Lucas rarely called, I answered with a calm voice. When he mocked me at family gatherings, I smiled as if unaffected. Eleanor thought I was becoming more patient, more serene. She didn't know that serenity was only the cover of a secret. There was no rush. I wanted the reveal to come at the right time, in front of the right people. I wanted the silence I had carried for so long to erupt into thunder. It was like sharpening a blade slowly, day after day. When the time came to cut, nothing could stop it. And that's how I lived those months. Outwardly, the same old carpenter. Inwardly, the man holding a truth that would change everything. Lucas thought he had the power, but each day that passed, the true power rested in my hands, locked away in a leather folder, hidden in the back of the closet, waiting for the day the door would be opened. The day of confrontation wasn't something I marked on a calendar. Life has its ironies. Sometimes it sets the stage for you, as if preparing a scene you've been rehearsing in silence for months. It was Lucas's birthday, 36 years old. He had organized a grand celebration in an upscale reception hall downtown. The invitation reached me almost out of obligation, delivered coldly by Sophie. "Of course you should come, Harold. After all, you're his father." The way she said, "after all," sounded more like duty than desire, but I accepted, not to please them, because I already knew, sooner or later, the day would come, and maybe it would be in that very hall. The moment I walked in, the impact was immediate. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden light, tables gleamed with extravagant arrangements of red and white flowers, waiters glided by with silver trays carrying champagne flutes. Soft music played while well-dressed guests spoke in rehearsed tones of elegance, and at the center of it all stood him, Lucas, impeccable in a navy blue suit, laughing loudly, greeting colleagues, local, politicians, businessmen. Sophie stood at his side, dazzling in a silver dress, radiating confidence. Together, they looked like a couple sculpted to be admired. No one noticed me when I arrived. No introduction. No acknowledgement. I sat at a side table, just another guest, as if I'd slipped in by mistake. I watched. I waited. Dinner moved along with speeches and toasts. Lucas strode through the hall with the ease of someone convinced he was at his peak, basking in applause and admiration. But, to me, he was still the boy who once leaned on me for his first steps, and now pretended I was the obstacle in his path. And then came the decisive moment. Just before the cake was cut, Lucas grabbed the microphone. The music stopped, conversations faded, and all eyes turned toward him. Friends, colleagues, family. Tonight is a special night, not just because of my birthday, but because we're celebrating achievements, new contracts, the future. He paused dramatically, something he had, learned in court. And I want to say that alongside my wife Sophie, we are ready to carry forward the Benton family legacy. The hall erupted in applause. Glasses were raised. I stayed seated. The Benton family legacy. The words echoed in my head like a hammer. He spoke of future, of inheritance, of continuity, and everyone in that hall believed that future already carried his name. In that instant, I understood. The stage was set. I rose slowly. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. They hadn't expected me, the invisible old man, to step forward. I walked toward the front, the leather folder under my arm. Silence deepened as I advanced. I stopped beside Lucas, who still held the microphone. He looked at me with a stiff smile, trying to keep control of the scene. "Dad, I'm glad you're here up front. Would you like to say a few words?" I took the microphone from his hand, gripped it tight. My voice came out calm, unhurried. "Interesting, Lucas. Very interesting that you should speak of legacy." Some guests laughed nervously, not understanding. I went on. "Because what nobody here knows is that today, your name was removed from my will." The hall dropped into silence. I heard the sharp clink of a glass hitting the floor, saw eyes darting, mouths open, people shifting in their seats. Sophie turned pale, her eyes wide. Lucas tried to laugh, but the sound died in his throat. I opened the leather folder, pulled out the papers. The family attorney, who happened to be present, invited by Lucas himself to showcase prestige, stood up at the back. His voice rang out firm. "It's true. The change has been made and recorded. The document is legal and binding." That confirmation landed like a verdict. Lucas stepped forward, trying to snatch the microphone back, but I held it firm. I looked into his eyes. That heavy silence in front of everyone was my weapon, and then I spoke the words that had been burning inside me ever since that day on the street. "You ignored me when you passed by as if I were nothing. Now, in front of everyone, I ignore your right to my inheritance." The words were short, sharp, final. Guests murmured in shock. Some looked at me with respect. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Sophie tried whispering something in Lucas's ear, but he stood frozen, as if struck by an invisible blow. I placed the microphone back on the stand, closed the folder calmly, and without raising my voice, I added, "Legacy is not money. It is not titles. Legacy is respect. And you, Lucas, are no longer part of mine." There was no applause, no laughter, only silence. A thick silence that pressed down on every guest. It was as if, in that moment, everyone realized the mask had fallen. I stepped back, walked to my table without hurry. Behind me, the hall stood still, frozen in time. Lucas remained at the front, the cake untouched, the microphone forgotten in his trembling hand. In that moment, I knew the man who erased me in front of others had just been erased before the very world he longed to impress. The words cut like a blade as they left my mouth. "You ignored me on the street. Now, in front of everyone, I ignore your right to my inheritance." The silence that followed wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a collective blow, as if every person in that hall had felt the blade slice through the air and stop at their chest. Eyes shifted everywhere, discomfort etched on faces. Some stared at the floor, others looked at Lucas, waiting for a reaction, but he had none. For seconds, that felt eternal. He just stood there, microphone still in hand, lips parted but voiceless. The man who loved speeches, who could fill courtrooms with eloquence, couldn't find a single word to respond. The confidence he had paraded only moments earlier drained from his face like ink running in the rain. Sophie was the first to move. She raised her hand to her mouth, trying to contain the shock. Her eyes darted from the guests to her husband, then to me, unable to settle. A couple whispered at the back, and the sound of glasses being set down on tables echoed louder than the music that had long since stopped. I looked at Lucas, not as an enemy, but as a stranger. The man before me wasn't the boy I once carried in my arms, walked to school, cheered at every achievement. No, the man standing there was someone who chose to erase his own father to shine alone. And ironically, in the very moment he had planned as his brightest, the light went out before everyone's eyes. He tried to speak, forced a smile that didn't hold, cleared his throat. His voice came out trembling. This can't be serious." That was all he managed. At that same moment, the attorney, the very one Lucas loved to flaunt as a symbol of status, stood and confirmed, "It's recorded. The change is official." The effect was devastating. His words struck like a gavel. No doubt, no loopholes. Lucas let the microphone slip from his hand. The sound of it hitting the metal floor reverberated through the hall like dry thunder. Sophie bent to pick it up, but she didn't hand it back. She held it tightly, as if trying to keep her husband from saying anything else. The guests were frozen. I saw one of Lucas's colleagues rub his forehead, uncomfortable. An older woman whispered to her husband, her eyes locked on me. A waiter stopped in the middle of the hall, the champagne tray trembling in his hands, trying to hide his curiosity. And me? I breathed deeply. There was no hatred in my voice, no shouting. The sentence I had spoken was short, almost dry, but it carried decades of silence, nights of sacrifice, years of contempt. It wasn't just a verdict, it was a manifesto. I looked at Lucas again. He was pale now, sweat running down his temple. He tried to hold his posture, but his body betrayed his arrogance. His shoulders slumped. His mouth hung half open. His eyes searched the crowd for sympathy, but there was none, not even Sophie's. Her hand still clutched the microphone, but she didn't try to defend him. That silence said more than words ever could. It was as if, suddenly, everyone saw the man behind the mask, not the victorious lawyer, not the promising heir, but the ungrateful son who had just lost everything with a single sentence. My own breath filled my chest, steady. Inside, a strange relief overcame me. I felt no joy in destroying my son. That wasn't it. What I felt was dignity returning to me. As if for the first time in years, I had taken back the voice he had tried to silence. And the most striking part wasn't the shock of the guests. It was Lucas's lack of response. He could have shouted. He could have tried to insult me. He could have scrambled for an excuse. But no, he stood frozen, defeated, exposed before the very people who had once applauded him. The party that was meant to crown his image had become a silent courtroom, and the verdict hadn't come from judges or jurors. It had come from a father, a tired father, but one still standing. As I walked back to my table, I felt the eyes following me, some full of shock, some of respect, some of quiet reflection. Few dared speak. The entire hall was swallowed by the weight of what had just happened. I sat down, placed the leather folder on my lap, ran my hand across it like sealing a decision. Lucas remained at the front, frozen, the birthday candles still burning, forgotten. Nobody had the courage to sing Happy Birthday. And in that instant, I realized there was no phrase more powerful than the one I had already spoken. It wasn't just an answer. It was a cut, a period. That moment would never be forgotten. Not by me, not by him, not by anyone in that hall. After the words were spoken, after the microphone hit the floor, the hall was never the same. The air itself seemed thicker, too heavy to breathe. I walked back to my table in silence, but inside me was a strange calm, almost solemn. Around me, the murmur began again, slowly, like the whisper of a storm, gathering strength. The guests didn't know whether to stay at the party or leave. Some looked at Lucas with pity, others with disdain. A few, bolder, began whispering to each other, pointing discreetly. I noticed one of his colleagues, who who had been flattering him only minutes before, glance at his phone, then set down his champagne glass as if he no longer wanted to be seen there. Sophie, still at his side, stood motionless. Her silver dress shimmered under the eye chandeliers, but her glow had vanished. Her lips trembled, her perfect posture on the verge of collapse. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. Lucas, meanwhile, stood frozen in front of the untouched cake. The candle still burned, a tiny flame mocking his paralysis. His hands sweated, his face pale, his eyes darting in every direction, searching for an ally. He found none. The attorney, who had confirmed my decision minutes earlier, approached him. He placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder and said softly, though I still heard it, "Harold is right. You have no claim anymore." Lucas brushed his hand away sharply but said nothing. The silence of everyone present was louder than any insult. Then something unexpected happened. One guest, a middle-aged man, walked over to me, straightened his tie and whispered, "You did what most fathers would be too afraid to do." Then he returned to his seat. Others began leaving. A woman slipped on her coat, muttered an excuse, and walked out. Then a couple followed. The hall, once filled with laughter and chatter, emptied little by little, like a party struck down by lightning. I remained seated, observing it all, not out of pride, but to etch every detail into memory. I knew that scene would haunt the rest of Lucas's life. When half the guests were gone, Lucas finally reacted. He grabbed the microphone again. His voice shook, though he tried to sound firm. "My father is mistaken. He can't just—" He didn't finish. The lawyer cut in. "Yes, he can. He already has." Silence swallowed the room once more. Sophie lowered her eyes, ashamed. Eleanor, my daughter, sat at a distant table. Our eyes met. She said nothing, but the tear she held back spoke everything. Relief and pain. Relief that I had finally stood up for myself. Pain because the wound was too deep to ever fully heal. The night ended without cake, without toasts, without applause. Waiters, embarrassed, cleared glasses and plates. I stood, picked up my leather folder, and walked toward the exit. Behind me, I heard hurried footsteps, half-hearted voices, people who didn't want to be the last to leave. Lucas remained inside, surrounded only by his own shadow. In the days that followed, the consequences spread like wildfire. News traveled fast. Rochester is far too small for big secrets. At the courthouse, colleagues whispered in hallways. In cafes, the story surfaced at every table. The rising lawyer disinherited by his own father. Some said it with curiosity, others with ridicule. Clients began to vanish, not because of the money lost. No one knew exactly how much was at stake, but because people don't trust a man without roots, a man publicly disowned by his own blood. Lucas's image, once prestige and power, was now arrogance and ingratitude. Sophie, too, couldn't bear the weight. One afternoon I heard she had left the house with her suitcases. "I won't live in a shadow," a neighbor claimed she said. The marriage, once there a trophy of success, began to crack for all to see. And me, I didn't rejoice in his downfall. That wasn't it. What I felt was justice. Cold, but necessary. Every slight, every mocking word he had used against me now turned back on him. I hadn't needed to raise my voice. I hadn't needed to fight. I had simply shown in front of everyone that dignity is not negotiable. In time, some tried to advise me. "You were too harsh, Harold. He's your son. Deep down, he'll regret it." But I only replied, I wasn't the one who severed the bond. He did. I merely signed what was already written in his actions. And so life went on. The town remained cold. Winter pressed on. But inside me burned a new flame. I was free. And at the same time, I had shown everyone that you cannot spit on the hand that built the foundation of your life without paying the price. Lucas, who once thought he owned the future, now had to live with the weight of a past he tried to deny. And in that bitter balance between what he lost and what I regained, the greatest consequence wasn't the inheritance itself. It was the truth revealed before all. And once truth is spoken, no one can erase it. The days after that night were not filled with euphoria. They were filled with silence. The kind of silence that doesn't suffocate, but sets you free. I walked the streets of Rochester in the same worn boots as always, but my stride was different. It was no longer the stride of a humiliated man. It was the stride of someone who had reclaimed his voice. People looked at me differently. At the grocery store, some nodded with respect. At the bakery, I heard whispers behind me. "That's him, old Benton. the one who cut off the arrogant son. They weren't mocking words. They carried admiration. For the first time in years, I wasn't invisible. Eleanor began visiting more often. We sat on the porch, drinking coffee as the cold morning wind blew. She looked at me as if she saw a whole man, not just a tired father. One day, holding my hand, she said, "Dad, I know it must have been hard, but I've never been prouder of you." The tears in her eyes reminded me of all the times I thought I had failed as a father. But in that moment, I realized I hadn't failed. I had shown my daughter that dignity is not for sale, not to be handed over, not to be bargained away. As for Lucas, the updates came from others. His office lost clients. His reputation crumbled. The local papers quietly reported broken contracts. Sophie soon filed for divorce. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat, because his downfall wasn't my triumph. My triumph was something else, proving that no son, no matter how successful, has the right to erase the history of the father who carried him. It was during this time I made another decision. I called Eleanor and told her, "I want you to know the inheritance now has a different purpose. Part of it will be yours, of course, but the other part will go to something bigger." She looked at me, puzzled. "Bigger how, Dad?" I explained. "I wanted to create a community fund for young apprentices in carpentry. I wanted boys and girls who had nothing to have tools, wood, and guidance. I wanted them to learn to build, not just furniture, but a future with their own hands. And so I did, watching those young people, their hands still free of calluses, discovering the smell of fresh wood, the sound of a plane gliding across grain, the pride of assembling their first chair. It was like reliving my own youth. Every smile was a reminder that true legacy isn't what you hoard in banks. It's what you plant in people. My house, simple as ever, remained the same. The wooden walls I had built still creaked against the strong wind. The swing in the backyard still withstood the rain. But inside, something was different. There was no longer the shadow of resentment, only the certainty that I had done what needed to be done. On a cold night, I sat alone on the porch. The sky was clear, and the stars shimmered above Rochester. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I remembered every humiliation, every silence, every wound. And I realized that paradoxically, those very things had given me strength. Because dignity doesn't grow from comfort. It is born at the breaking point. At the moment, you decide you will not be erased. And that is what I leave as reflection. You can lose possessions. You can lose friends. You can even lose the respect of those you love most. But if you don't lose the high truth of who you are, then nothing is truly lost. If one day Lucas comes back to me, I don't know how I'll react. Maybe I'll listen. Maybe I won't. But one thing I know for sure, he will never again look at me as if I were invisible. Because now, before him and before everyone, I've already proven that the weight of a lifetime cannot be carried in silence forever. Silence speaks too, and sometimes it speaks louder than any shout. And now I want to hear from you. Has anyone ever tried to silence your voice inside your own family? Have they tried to shrink you as if you were nothing? Share it in the comments. Your story matters. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because every time you comment, every time you take part, we prove together that respect isn't begged for. Respect is earned.